All right, if everybody's ready, I'd like to call to order this committee of the whole for Tuesday, December 13th. In honor of the Leewatchul, the Village of Pevin acknowledges that we are here today meeting the unceded territory of the Leewat Nation. Are there any amendments to the agenda? Seeing none, motion approved is presented. Councillor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Ramsden. Any opposed? Motion carries. Approval of minutes from committee of the whole number 234 from October 4th, moved by Councillor Craddock, second by Councillor Helmer. Any discussion? Opposed? Carries. And we're going to get right into our delegations. Are you going to join us at the table, Kevin? Or we got Kevin Clark, operations manager for the PBDD, giving us a bit of an overview of our flood risks. Thanks for coming, Kevin.
Good. So thanks for the opportunity to present the new council and congratulations on all of your elections. We hope that we can shed some light on the current risk conditions, current focus of the Dyking District works, and maybe dispel some local myths all at the same time. A bit of background on the Dyking District for those who are new. Dyking District is fortunately and unfortunately an improvement district. It operates in partnership with the village, the regional district, and the Lillooet Nation. We're run by a board of directors. We meet once a month. For those that don't know, like kind of the structure, I'm the manager. And other than the summer labor we hire one person from May to September, and the office staff. I'm technically an army of one person. So we operate one of the largest diking single source or single group diking districts in BC, 44 kilometers of dikes, 26 kilometers of ditches and canals, 38 culverts that we have to go and touch every month to make sure they're clear, 5 different hydrometric gauges, and those gauges are now under the banner of the Pemberton Valley Emergency Management Committee, which is the village, the regional district, Lillooet, and the Dyking District. We meet roughly once a month. Usually it's about 9 or 10 times a year because in the summer, the holidays and stuff, it's not as important. We have one sediment trap, which is on Miller Creek, 3 sediment management areas, Pemberton Creek and Lower Miller Creek. So that means we have to go and dig it out every once in a while. This year we had a record 13 beaver dams under management and permit. So that means 2 or 3 days a week we're out there by hand letting water out through dams, piping them, and 2 salmon habitat channels that we maintain. Wonderful beaver dam on the lower left there is on the Arm Canal. So to frame the next few slides, I just wanted to discuss that there's 2 kinds of kind of risk measurement. One is return period. So when you hear 1 in 50, 1 in 100, but that kind of misleads people. The better way to do it, what I try to use, but I try to go back and forth just so people get used to hearing them, is AEP, or annual exceedance probability. So basically, if you look on the lower left there, the return period of say 1 in 100 is actually a 1% chance of happening every single year. People sometimes like, well, it happened last year. What are the chances? But realistically, it's not a ton different. So if I say 1 in 10, that's 10% chance a year. I kind of use them, like I say, interchangeably, but it's, you know, we need to sort through the differences between the 2 because they're used by different people for different things. The other thing for context is the Northwest Hydraulics did a 2018 floodplain mapping where they mapped all of the rivers, and in the top right, they suggested that the total estimated flows for say a 1 in 200 is 2,113. I'll get to that number in a minute. And the River Forecast Center, you can see, is less than that. It's 1668 or something like that. And there's a discrepancy because NHC used new numbers for their 2018 modeling, which they did their own runoff modeling, and that's the separation between the 2. We don't actually know what is correct somewhere in there. And in this, that would super matter.
Nice, that's a good question, Kevin. Does return period mean like a high level?
Yeah, so if we get a, so right now, our flood of record is 2003. And that would be a roughly 1 in 100 year return period.
Okay.
So in 2003, the flood peaked at 1,490 cubic meters per second. And the return period for 1 in 100 is 1410. So it's somewhere in that neighborhood. So.
Thank you.
So Pemberton's a kind of a complex area. We flood in many different ways. The 2018 floodplain mapping study used kind of a Lillooet based flood, but we can flood from the Ryan, the Green, Pemberton Creek. So everything, it's the sum of all of the kind of where the water's coming from. So there's a lot of kind of misconception, I think, about Pemberton's current flood risk. So I broke it into a few areas. So the town area where we're sitting, not where we're sitting because we're not in the floodplain, Upper Meadows, Mount Currie, and the airport area. So to put it into context, during the heat dome a few years ago, that was about a 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 year event. 2016, kind of the last flood that we had, and it was of any sort of thing, was a 1 in 20 year event. And of course, the 2003 was a 1 in 100. So does anybody have any idea where they think one of these areas, town, Upper Meadows, Mount Currie, what kind of protection we have? Like, hear all sorts of funny numbers. So there's the answer. So town itself, so like an area like the Glen, has about a 2% chance of flooding every single year. The Upper Meadows has about the same, a little bit higher, and that is mostly due to the Mount Meter slide debris being there first. It's on its way here. Mount Currie area, so I kind of paint that as any area kind of from North Arm Farm south, has about a 1 in 10 return period, or about a 3 to 10%. 1 in 10 to 1 in 30. And then the airport has about a 1 in 10. It's kind of important to point out that Mount Currie itself, like south of, well, really south of the bridge and the airport, are all in the old Lillooet River channel. That's why they flood first. It was all historically the river, and then over time we started building stuff on it. Interesting fact is, other than Pemberton Creek Dike, not one of our dikes has been wet since 2016. So if we had no dikes in Pemberton, we would have had no flood issues in the last 6 years. Amplitude is another one. So if you look at the numbers, the difference between a 1 in 50 year and a 1 in 200 year is only about 470 cubic meters per second, or about 28%. So a 1 in 200 year event isn't insanely bigger than a 1 in 100. It's just, that's the way the numbers work. So most people incorrectly think that. So if we look at the past few years as well, and our recent flood events, this year when we got nice and warm in June, we hit 612 cubic meters of water per second. In 2021, during the heat dome, we hit 758. 2016 was 956. And then it goes on from there. So 1490 in 2003 was the biggest recent flood we had. And even though 1984 was a much worse result for the town, a lot of diking was built after that, and the dikes breached in 1984, and that's why the water levels were much higher. So the difference between a 1 in 50 year and a 1 in 100 year is about the normal amount of water that you see going down the river in the summer. So it's not a huge amount, but it is enough. Interesting context though, well, we were stressed out last year at about 758 cubic meters per second. The Fraser River is doing 10,000 cubic meters at the same time. And 2 or 3 years ago, the Amazon hit 300,000 cubic meters of water per second. So, and keep in mind, 758 during the heat dome, that's 758,000 liters per second. A lot of water. So the PVDD and the PVEMC in the last few years, we've kind of changed the way that we're doing things to not just the physical things, but also the forecasting. So The data, we have a huge amount of real-time data, and that's data that I can pull my phone or my iPad out or my computer, and I can look at nearly everything. In the graph on the right, we have real-time temperature, precipitation at the airport and at Tanquil Lake. So we can tell where the freezing level is. We also have Callahan, Whistler, Blackcomb, a bunch of stuff, Green Mountain. So we do have a ton of real-time data, which really helps us in our forecasting. The snowpack gauge at Tanquil Lake is wonderful because we can look at when the snowpack is essentially gone to zero at about 1,700 meters, which is where we can rapidly melt snow. Interestingly enough, on day one of the heat dome, this Tanquil Lake snow gauge went to zero. So if that heat dome was 1 week earlier, it could have been entirely different. That was just a fluke. In the graph on the left, we have all the levels and trends of every single river in the area, including the Arm Canal and North Arm Channel. And that took the last 3 years to put all that together. We also monitor Lillooet Lake level closely, because if we start out a rain event and the lake is empty versus full, big difference for us. So last year, November 15th, we started out empty lake, it filled right up. And then November 30th came, the lake hadn't emptied yet because it takes 2 to 3 weeks sometimes for it to go back to where it should be. And that's why we had a lot of more localized flooding in the Mount Currie area. So the other problem, well, it's not a problem, but it causes stress, is we have more data than Environment Canada and the River Forecast Center do, because they can only use data that's vetted by their own system. So I have data from Run of River up at Interjects, but I can't share it with them. I have data from Mount Currie Development Corp, but I can't share it with them because of liability reasons. So we can routinely build resolution on a forecast that corrects their forecast. It's not because they're doing it poorly, because we have more information. This is a forecast from past June. This is available online. Anyone can look at it from the River Forecast Center. It forecasts what the river has done and then what it's going to do, or what they think it's going to do. A major issue, as I said, with the RFC models is they struggle in a heat-induced snowmelt event. So the spring problems that we have, the models are not very well tuned for that because of the lack of snow level data. How much snow is there at 500 meters, 1,000 meters, 2,000 meters? It's not stratified well. We also don't have solar radiation measurements. And a lot of areas will have a solar panel up there and they can tell by how much wattage is coming through it, how strong the sun is, and how, so that leads to how fast the snow can melt. We have data from Interjects, but again, we can't share it. So, you know, we have to use a lot of local inputs to correct that. The river forecast models are really good at forecasting fall rain on snow events. More years of doing this, and these are the risky events for Pemberton. These models are run overnight and attempt to forecast the next few days of river characteristics. The problem is they use a fixed data set for inputs and can't contextualize what happened yesterday overnight and what's happening right now. That's where the PBDD can step in and add resolution to the forecast using local real-time and visual inputs, such as real-time freezing level, alpine temperature, and snow data. In some cases, prior to the spring heat events, we've actually taken steps to fly the area in a helicopter to figure out how much snow is actually below 1,700 meters. Is it only in the shady valleys or is it everywhere? Makes a huge, huge difference. Where it gets tricky is when the River Forecast Center says the rivers go high or they won't go high, and the Diking District has the opposite opinion, because if we have to go for a task number and there's no high stream flow advisor, it's very difficult to get one. But we can both be wrong. We're human. But we do, on the lead up to any event, heat or snow or rain, have a direct line to River Forecast Center and Environment Canada. We're on the phone all the time. We would actually be lost without. A little bit more on local data. Our rivers peak at different times of the day because of their length. So one more thing that we can add context to is we'll watch and see, did the Green River peak at 2 p.m. in the afternoon higher than it did yesterday? And if it didn't, then it's highly unlikely that the Lillooet River is going to do that. And we also have a second check at 8 o'clock at Pembina Creek. Birkenhead peaks around 3, but it's a totally different weather system out there. They don't have any snow out there right now, so it's a bit of an outlier. So the PVD focus moving forward is replacing a lot of aging infrastructure, plugging a lot of holes. We have a lot of older culverts and older flap gates that are, you know, past their service life, and we have a 3 to 5 year plan to replace them all. Got mixed up there. But there are many factors which inhibit Pemberton as a whole from drastically increasing its level of flood protection. These are issues as large amounts of funds are needed to acquire properties, provincial dike design complications that are not easier to overcome, seismic. So we're working to try to remove these barriers, and we need to focus on what we have at the meantime. So that's why we're trying to reinforce everything we have. So on the left picture there, that's the new real-time monitoring gauge at North Farm, basically. So that tells us when the airport road will overtop, that tells us exactly what's happening in the lowest lying areas. The middle picture is some new floodgates we installed out by Riverlands Ranch that go under the highway, because when the river comes up, it goes backwards and floods on the other side of the road. And on the right, that's the new culvert we put in at North Arm Channel itself. And would have been really nice to have that last fall. There are a few possible diking projects that would be possible east of the Highway 99 bridge, and the Diking District and Lillooet are working on this, but there's many hurdles to overcome. The other issue is existing dikes cannot be made higher as they must move back from the river's edge some amount. In the meantime, sediment removals. So for the past 3 years, the Diking District and its partners have successfully funded sediment removals from strategic locations along the river. Those areas are shown, those circles on the map on the right. We remove roughly 60,000 cubic meters each year, but this can only happen if we can secure funding, permits, or sales of sediment to cover the removals. We have a contract to perform this work for the next 2 years. However, the permitting process and the sediment market is making this effort increasingly difficult. So we need to find a long way to fund and permit this work. The Diking District has proven that the works are effective, but the province does not agree that the sediment removal works are good or a good long-term solution, even though they are done with success all over the world. Given the current constraints on what the Diking District and its partners can do, sediment removals is our single best tool right now to lower future flood risk. MOTI. We have a MOTI problem. Many pieces of the MOTI infrastructure can flood us unnecessarily. So that's all the culverts that pass under the roads. It's MOTI's current position that they're not responsible for their infrastructure causing problems such as Grandmother Slough and other areas. MLA Sturdy and the Diking District are working on a letter to the minister to try to get this issue resolved, but it'd be great if other local governments could take up the charge as well. There are many locations along Highway 99, McCrae Road, Riverlands, Erickson Road, and areas along the Lake Road, Pemberton Meadows Road, and others. The MOTI has drainage systems for their highways and roads that are either in poor condition, lack floodgates, or can cause flooding due to beaver issues or general plugging. It is currently MOTI's position they're not responsible for anything other than the integrity of the road. We have a similar issue with CN, but as they're federally regulated, that's not likely to be resolved easily. The Diking District does spend a lot of time lobbying both of those groups for action.
Kevin, can I just interrupt on that one? So with the letter you're putting together with Jordan, is that to have them do a higher level of maintenance on those culverts, or is it to give you the ability to do work on their infrastructure?
We don't know yet. We haven't been able to get all the way up to the minister yet. And so we're going to try to figure out what our tact will be on the way there. We would prefer if the maintenance was part of the highways contractor because of the liability of us touching their infrastructure. It's not easy.
Sir, can I just clarify? So they're responsible for putting that infrastructure in, but not for maintaining it? Is that?
They only maintain it if the infrastructure is damaged to a point where the structural integrity of the road is at risk.
Okay.
So just because we're flooding 13 homes in Mount Curry and their septic fields are flooded, doesn't mean they have to unplug the culvert. It's their current situation. The second MOTI issue is access and egress in the case of an emergency. Both north along the Duffy Lake Road and south to Whistler can get cut off fairly early on in this flood scenario. The north route gets cut off in a few locations, but the most likely two are shown on the map, and you can kind of see the circles. So when the lake level comes up, it goes over the road, and when the Birkenhead comes up, it goes over the road in the other spot. The first one is from High Birkenhead River. The second one's from High Lillooet Lake level. The south route is governed by the Pemberton Creek Bridge and flooding along from 1 Mile Lake. This is an issue the PVD has raised several times with MOTI, and yet we don't have any promise of work to remedy this in the future. So that picture, it was taken in November 2015, and that's the water touching the bottom of Pemberton Creek Bridge. The existence of the PVDD is currently in flux as the province wants the PVDD to join the SLRD. Emily Sturdy and myself have been working hard to keep the PVDD alive in its current form and have had several meetings with municipal affairs. So far, we've made little progress. This issue is going to severely hamper future diking works with government-funded monies in the Pemberton Valley. It's important to note that simply joining the SLRD does not fix this problem, and there are other issues at the ministerial level that would have to change as well. Actual policy would have to change. The other issue is even if we could apply for funding, given that we assume we join the SLRD, all funding that's currently available is a 60-40 split. So that means the group would have to come up with 400 grand for $1 million project, and $1 million project. The North Arm Channel outlet was almost $1 million. The Arm Canal was $1.3 million. So $1 million doesn't really get you much. But looking at this, the Dike District has shifted into savings mode in the last 2 years. So we're trying to build up a bit of a bank account. So if we can straighten out this funding thing, that we can have money to at least look at doing some things. In 2021, the PVDD and MLA Sturdy sent a letter to the minister. The village, the SLRD, and Lillooet Nation all sent a letter of support saying they wish to keep the PVD as a separate entity. MLA Sturdy and myself did end up having with the minister a meeting with the minister, and have had a few follow-up meetings since. Unfortunately, that minister was taken out of that position right after that. There's no easy path forward at this time. But I was just at a conference in Vancouver about the new flood intentions paper, and was talking with the new provincial inspector of dikes, and they've been having a lot of meetings about what to do with us as well. So where this leaves us right now is that almost all the provincial and federal funding streams to complete diking projects are not available for us to apply for. Lillooet's the only entity in the valley that has that ability. Also, the way we used to do it, where the village or the SLRD would apply on the Diking District's behalf, has been taken away from us as well. In the coming years, due to sediment filling in the river, the gravity drainage that we've relied on for all these years is going to become a problem. There's likely 5 locations that require some permanent installations of a pump station. This is because, as I said, the gravity drainage will become less effective because the rivers are filling up. Although there's only one location that's high risk, I thought I would outline all the areas on the map. So every one of those arrows is somewhere where at some point in the future, we're going to need a pump station. The main one is at the Arm Canal. We should be exploring this fairly soon, the next couple of years. The need for this system is growing as most of the new developments will be looking at discharging into the Arm Canal for drainage, and it currently doesn't have the capacity to do this with any reliability.
Yeah, if you don't have, what's the average cost of a pumping station?
The problem is the volume. I'm going for a meeting in January with District of Squamish, as they have several pumping stations, and after that I'll have a better idea. And it also depends on the Department of Fisheries and Oceans designation of the area as to how complex it has to be for fish habitat. I mean, essentially the pump station would sit idle 99% of the time, but then when we need it, we really need it. And the volumes that are required are so big during a rain event that it's not really feasible to order that many pumps and set them up to pump that volume. It would take a week to set up the pumps, and we don't have that much time. Public education and preparedness. With the amount of new residents that are moving into the area and judging by the amount of people I talk to ask very basic flood related questions, I think we need to step up the education piece. The Daikin District has reached out to schools to explore an education opportunity in the school system, but a joint PVMC public education piece would likely be a good option. The more our residents understand how and why we flood and the more trust we can build, the better chance we have of making the best possible outcome of a future event that we all know will happen one day. The PVDD through the village partnered with Lillooet to model some new diking routes and explore transfer of risk. So transfer of risk is if you build a piece of infrastructure to hold water out, what will that do immediately up and immediately downstream? You cannot build a dike to protect an area that will flood another area that wouldn't have already flooded. You can't make it worse. This will be completed in Q1 of 2023, and we will review with the PVMC at that time. It will outline actionable dike routing. So key word there is actionable. This is what can be done versus what everybody wishes could be done. And it's a guide to getting our protection levels up to what I would call acceptable levels. Likely won't be a 1 in 200 year event plus climate change, which is what the province wants. But federally, it's 1 in 100 years. They have two conflicting scenarios. It will also outline the properties that will be dry in a flood event versus wet if the infrastructure was not built. So you can see this is preliminary data, but with some of the proposed diking, there would be 359 properties in the village that would be dry versus our current scenario. And that's 324 and a little lot 63. So once we get that, I will share it. A note of caution is that the dikes will likely not be in their current locations and people will have to be relocated to achieve this. There is a property that's currently for sale. The PVD has been looking for ways to purchase this property, but as of now has not been able to find an avenue. Acquiring this property would enable the valley to perform a project that would be the biggest possible advancement in our flood control infrastructure. Along with this, the amount of green space and habitat that would be generated would be amazing. If anybody has any good ideas, please reach out.
You want to tell them which property you're talking about?
Which property is that? Is that the?
That's a property that's on the east side of Highway 99 bridge.
Which would allow for like a setback dike on there that would significantly change our protection.
Yeah, and the biggest difference or the biggest gain in that is that on this side of the highway, this works. On this side of the highway, the abutment, so you know the road's quite raised. Need big holes under the road with culverts to allow water through. Because this is what happens both with the CN rail bridge upstream and the highway bridge is all the water has to squeeze under the bridge and it doesn't fit. We need more room for the water to be water. On November 29th, myself and the PVD board chair attended a provincial engagement meeting in Chilliwack. This meeting was a fact-finding forum put on by the province to look at reshaping how the province involves itself in flood mitigation in BC. It was good to get out and interact with other flood prevention jurisdictions as well as the provincial regulators. The PVDD will be preparing a response to the intentions paper and submitting it on January 6th. We hope that this will help shape the future of our relationship with the province, but we'll have to wait and see what becomes of this. Anyone can read the intentions paper online. Just have to Google it. It's a very interesting document. And that's it. If anybody wants to reach out to me, there's my email. I'll be happy to answer questions should there be time.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it. Any questions? Want to start? Anybody? Well, again, Kevin, I mean, we've chatted a lot about it before, but as you're looking at keeping the Diking District its own entity and whatever village can do to support that. You know, part of the complicated thing, we've talked about this a little bit before, is, you know, the majority of the dike, you know, if the PVDD were to go to, let's say the SLRD, number one, as Kevin spelled out, we lose a bunch of funding opportunities right off the bat. And then number two, it's an interesting situation. This is what we're trying to paint to the province is the vast majority of the dikes that Kevin maintains, our infrastructure is in the SLRD. The majority of the funds to pay for those dikes come from the Village of Pemberton. So where does this belong? And right now, the way in my mind, the way it works with Kevin running it as independently, I think serves all of our needs, including the One Nation, really, really well. And I think we coordinate well. The PVMC has been a great addition over the last few years. So that's sort of where the struggle is on that one. So again, if there's ways we can support that conversation, let us know.
Thank you.
And how have we supported the conversations with MOTI to date?
Well, we did, I think we supplied one letter and I might have made a phone call too, which I don't know if that helped.
I think we're gonna have to turn the volume up on that in the new year, so.
Yeah, and again, let us know.
And are there other communities in our situation similar to us that you're?
With the Dayton district being a standalone entity, yes, the only other major one is Creston. And they have an even more complicated local governance boundary scenario.
It's like you can pull together with other people.
For policy at ministry level, yes, but for like local conversation, it's not quite the same. The major hurdle that we're finding is that the ministry can't figure out how to leave us alone without setting precedents for every other improvement district to have recourse. Why would you let Dayton district do this and we can't do that? I did a deep dive. There's like 173, 193 improvement districts, and I'd say 99% of them make absolute sense to amalgamate because they're like a small water district or a small sewer district or some small supplier of a thing, and it neighbors a regional district or a municipality. So it makes total sense to amalgamate them in. The driver for the province is like you can envision a small water district way up north, and there's no accountability. The financial, isn't there. Where does the money go? They want to kind of phase it out into somebody that they think is going to be more responsible. Now I can't say that there's probably not a ton of really responsible small districts, but that's kind of the driving factor. I did reach out to several people offering, please come and audit our finances and our operations and our day-to-day works and tell me if you think that we aren't being as productive with a tax dollar as possible. We're such a small entity. The amount of dollars that we take in and go to doing a thing is extremely high because we have no overhead costs. So amalgamating with a bigger entity, no matter what it is, will just add to that overhead cost. So the tax rate would have to go up to maintain the same level of service. That's no one's fault. It's just that's what happens when an entity gets bigger.
And the MOTI conversation still blows me away. I mean, I was on a phone call with Kevin last November and I remember hearing the MOTI rep saying, well, our infrastructure is fine. And Kevin had already painted the picture what he was challenged with. And so we're all good basically. And I spoke up and said, I'd love to see that in writing. That I can't believe there's no liability connected to that at all, to their infrastructure, to people's homes. But yeah,
that was the moment where I asked for a letter from their legal counsel stating that that is indeed the case. And
yeah. Did you ever get any?
no, the culvert got unplugged the next day.
There you go. So maybe that's the avenue to keep pushing.
Yeah.
Position on.
We're trying, that's one of the avenues that there are, one of the outcomes we're hoping to clarify in the new year.
And I did bring it to UBCM, to the ministry, to talk about including some of that in the contract with our roads maintenance contractor. Thanks for coming, Kevin. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
We got Dave doing the presentation on the joint flood evacuation planning. Whenever you're ready. Assumed you will.
Okay, thanks for having me here this afternoon. So Kevin kind of talked about our flood risk in the valley, but I'm going to talk about a piece, tiny little piece on what we're doing in terms of preparedness. So The purpose of this presentation is for council to develop a greater understanding of current organizational emergency management capabilities as it relates to evacuation planning. The village partnered with the SLRD and the District of Squamish to facilitate a Pemberton Valley and Squamish floodplain joint flood evacuation planning project, which was funded through a joint application to the UBCM Community Emergency Preparedness Fund, and specifically evacuation route planning funding stream. And the intent of this project was to first collaboratively address flood evacuation issues that are shared across jurisdictions of the SLRD, and recognizing that Lillooet Nation and Squamish Nation are key stakeholders, and they were a part of the project steering committee. We clearly identified route challenges and high demand limited resources for mass evacuation, which included RCMP officers, traffic management personnel, and equipment. And we addressed how such resources would be allocated and prioritized when multiple jurisdictions are affected. Another major component of this project was to deliver a functional evacuation exercise that informed, tested, and validated the underlying processes and assumptions as it relates to evacuation, and to improve public safety and facilitate increasingly integrated evacuation planning and procedures through the development of an operational evacuation route plan and a regional evacuation framework document that captures recommendations and high-level regional considerations. On October 5th of 2022, a multi-jurisdictional flood and evacuation exercise was held. And the intent of this exercise was to test the underlying processes and assumptions relating to evacuation and to practice other elements of sub-regional strategic coordination to a widespread flooding event. The objectives for this functional exercise included a test of the strategic support elements of response and evacuation plans in a flood scenario. That included the testing of mobilization, staffing, and coordination of the emergency operations centers in impacted communities, practice the procedures and authorities required to evacuate a population at risk, manage resources effectively in support of flood operations and emergency support services, evaluate contingency strategies and priorities for critical infrastructure restoration, coordinate crisis communications with residents and stakeholders, coordinate shared resources throughout the region and manage those effectively, seek synergies and opportunities for regional coordination, and identify gaps and areas for improvement in both emergency operations center processes and evacuation planning as a whole. And the exercise focused on the application of training, skills, and coordination to identify gaps, lessons learned, and best practices associated with revised plans and the exercise play. There were 55 participants that joined from across the region, with 18 of those being village staff members. We were extremely fortunate to be facilitated by Mike Andrews, who's a former manager of Emergency Management BC, and who has worked in emergency management for several local authorities. And Mike was kind enough to provide the village with an in-kind and beyond the scope of the exercise contract, a report of his observations and recommendations. And so I'd just like to kind of summarize some feedback that he provided us, and I'll be quoting him when I speak to this. Staff participating performed extremely well, worked as a team under leadership that extended from the CAO down through the organizational chart. The team demonstrated strong foundational knowledge of hazards facing the community, local capabilities and capacities, sub-regional support mechanisms, as well as emergency management roles, responsibilities, and processes. The projection of leadership, especially those in leadership positions, was exceptional, notable by the CAO, who assumed the role of EOC director, and was clear in delegation of responsibilities and allowing the capable staff to conduct those activities without undue interference. Similarly, the emergency program coordinator, as the local expert, was supportive in coaching and advising on the intricacies of emergency management, the maintenance of comprehensive situational awareness by the manager of operations, and his clear and concise communications to both the planning and logistics sections, who executed the necessary support admirably. Finance demonstrated an understanding of provincial cost recovery processes and the mechanisms for maximizing the village's claim. We also captured some feedback from staff that participated in the exercise, and to kind of summarize that, there was exceptional teamwork, organization, and communication throughout the exercise, and that staff feel much more confident and prepared in their roles for an actual event. We also conducted an after-action review to identify best practices, gaps, and lessons learned, and to capture operational opportunities for future events. So the first one being facility considerations. The village's primary EOC is established by temporarily repurposing the council chambers. In prolonged events, this would displace council, but otherwise, this facility is wholly unsuitable to function as an EOC for any but the most minor of events. The primary challenge for the facility is insufficient space, inadequate technical systems, and there's no redundancies. And there's also some safety hazards. Another component was information technology improvements, which have been identified. And these include those redundancies, audio-visual needs, and GIS capabilities. Staffing was another component in the after-action review. So ensuring organizational depth will allow for continuous representation in prolonged events and the flexibility to maintain some element of continuity of critical village routine operations despite any crisis. Another component was the training and operational readiness. So funding and formalizing a multi-year training and exercise program that focuses on functional training, discussion-based exercises, and simple process-driven drills to support staff in maintaining proficiency. And also offering some condensed refresher training for those experienced personnel in an EOC. Another quote from Mike Andrews' report kind of summarizes the significance of and the importance of these recommendations. And that quote would be, with changing and evolving hazardscapes in BC and beyond, and especially in the historically high impact Pemberton Valley, these capable staff must be empowered with the necessary space and technical systems to manage a crisis, ensure municipal continuity of critical operations, and to support the citizens of the village of Pemberton in their greatest time of need.
Sarah, can I just ask a question? On your upgrading this area here, have you got anything in the budget for next year so that it brings up to the standard they're looking for, or is it just not going to be functional?
We're identifying a few upgrades, but also looking at an alternate space that might be much more suitable within the community center. And it's also identified as our secondary or joint emergency operations center. So yeah, currently looking at both upgrades within this space, but also a secondary option. In terms of outputs from both the project and the exercise, a regional evacuation framework was developed, which complements the existing regional approach to emergency management and facilitates a standardized and collaborative approach to coordinating and allocating when the region is experiencing multiple flood events throughout the Sea to Sky corridor. It provides recommendations for further strengthening the efficiency of evacuation plans and resource sharing and availability while providing high-level regional considerations to include in each local level evacuation route plan. The operational evacuation plan provides guidance and tools to facilitate the coordination of an evacuation and will be used in conjunction with existing emergency management plans, as well as the regional evacuation framework. In terms of next steps, these include the implementation of the after-action report recommendations, which include the IT and facility considerations, and building that organizational depth by continued training and exercises. There's been significant regional and local level work in identifying high-risk areas, route challenges, and capacity issues. And in order to effectively leverage this knowledge and the recommendations presented in the regional evacuation framework, The project steering committee will convene for an action planning workshop, and this will allow us to discuss and prioritize each recommendation. And we can develop a strategic plan to identify clear deliverables and outcomes for future phases of evacuation planning. Evacuation planning will be an ongoing project, but by creating a short-term action plan and subsequent long-term strategic plan, we can begin to map out priorities for future phases and foster continued momentum on a critical component of a strong emergency program. That's it. Happy to answer some questions if there is.
Yeah. Any questions? I don't want it.
Yeah, sorry, with your evacuation, you got a road north and a road south.
Correct.
Basically. And looking at Kevin's presentation, if the Pemmican Creek goes out, quite likely at the same time, it's gonna go out up at Lillooet Lake. What's our next option?
Yeah, that's a whole larger scenario than what we were planning for in this kind of exercise in this project. In terms of a scenario like that, that would most likely be a shelter in place or high ground scenario. And there's further planning and a lot of work kind of done.
One issue that brings up is that it have to make that alternative. So that elevates the risk of having a false evacuation.
Right.
Because you can't lead too late into it as you could with reliable egress. So if you have too many false alarms, it's not good either. So it's a Sarah and I have stressed about it. One other thing out of I got to sit in Village SLRD and District of Squamish kind of post this, and I was in the simulation, so we were the ones making phone calls saying, hey, the river's doing this and sending emails and doing all that stuff. The one thing that the SLRD highlighted was a lack of communication between the village EOC and the SLRD EOC, and the need for us as a group, because what happens is I end up in 2 EOCs plus in the field. And admittedly, November 15th last year, I did a good job of it. And by November 30th, no sleep in 2 weeks. I definitely didn't support Sarah or the other Sarah at the time as good as I could have, just running out of gas, being in 2 EOCs at the same time. So there's definitely an opportunity there for better liaising and passing on of information.
Thank you.
My question was just for flood evacuation, does a similar thing happen for fire, or it's sort of not relevant to this, but is a similar activity you go through for that, or?
Yeah, so pretty much all of our emergency plans are all hazard. This was just specific to a flood scenario. In the past, we have done scenarios relating to a wildfire. But yeah, most of our plans try and stick to all hazards that they can be.
They can be
transferable.
transferable. That's sort of what I was
Yeah.
wondering. Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions? Awesome. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
That was great. Take 1 minute when the camera gets set up.
Thanks, Sarah.
Really don't like standing next to him. I try to forget how short I am. He doesn't. Kevin, you all set up?
Yes,
Are you ready? We're on to 5.1. And I'll leave it to you to take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good afternoon, everyone. Here today to introduce an application that you're going to see an awful lot of over the next coming months, or you're well into next year for sure. And I'm going to butcher the name, but it's an Ngokmwa Benchlands application. So this is a large piece of land that has a long history in the village. and it is the subject of a major development application right now. So apologies, I guess, before I get too far, for the long-winded historical report. That's not my typical style, but it was kind of necessary in this case to try and bring everyone up to speed on what we're dealing with. And there are some limitations on this that I'm gonna discuss. So today's intended to be an update. I imagine by end of January or February, we'll be delving into very substantive considerations in the application. So please do accept today's update with a promise that you'll get your fingers more than dirty on this the next time you see it, if you choose. So again, jumped ahead of myself a little bit, but there is an active OCP amendment and rezoning application on these lands. And it's going through quite a long process. There's a lot of different moving parts that I'll give you a snapshot of today, but the next time you see it again, you'll get a much more detailed submission. So in terms of background, there is a long history with this one. It involved a number of different agencies, municipalities, shifting hats, changing roles, all of those things. But in short, in 2007, these lands were identified as development lands necessary for the village of Pemberton. And what that amounted to was an inclusion in the official community plan as part of the growth area. So all of the village's projections around growth and how it's going to handle growth include these lands. If you look at the OCP map, which I'll show you in a second, it actually even has an old road alignment on it and so on. But very little has been developed. Effectively, the first phase is built, but anything beyond that has not moved forward since 2007. The lands were also rezoned at that time for residential 1. So what that means is that with just a subdivision alone application, those lands could be developed. What's happened to the first bullet, there's been an ownership change. The lands were taken out of the Crown Land Bank in a partnership by Skankakum Development Limited, which is a partnership between Little Rock Capital Assets and Benchlands Development Corporation. So about a year ago, a little over a year ago, those lands became fee simple lands. They're now titled in that company's name, and they're pursuing the development. And I think what really came about was, with all respect to the work that was done in 2007, there's a lot of different thinking about land use. There's better mapping, there's better understanding of land and terrain. There's shifting values around what's important to not just the village, but to the market and everything else. And so rather than proceed on the strength of the approvals that are already in place, we started a discussion around a refresh of the application, a refresh of the approach. And that's really what we're dealing with today. The lands in question, about 60 acres, 60 hectares, 148 acres. There's a chunk that's in the SLRD. We anticipate that there will be a petition or an application to include those in the village boundary, though they're not really critical to the development, at least in the early stages. So of course, the policy work that we're doing for the OCP amendment and rezoning would apply only to the lands within the village. Even with that, it's a large titled area. There are some constraints with contamination at the old gun range site. So we are proceeding, at least at this time, with the OCP amendment over all of the lands and the rezoning on the first stage, which would be 31 hectares or 77 acres. So there's this constantly evolving. There's things that are changing all of the time, but that's where we are, at least at this point. So the eastern portions will probably have their own distinct policy set for how they'll be dealt with through the contamination, taking into account, again, some information that has become much clearer since the original 2007 approvals and some of the encumbrances on those lands. So when we look at the drawings, again, this is very conceptual. The applicants provided a slight update to this because there's another drainage course that was discovered through the public consultation process, so don't put a lot of stock in this generally, but it's starting to take shape. We're starting to see the portions of the site that are developable in a way that makes some sense based on current planning frameworks and the marketplace and so on. And this is a bit of a change from what we'll see before. And largely, I think that's a result of what I would consider to be a very exhaustive analysis of the land using LiDAR, some industry-leading land design experts that really understand terrain and how to make it work and how to find portions that are developable and respect and retain portions that should remain green, either because of topography or environmental significance or other things. So the net result of this draft The concept that we're working with is 270 mixed housing units. And a combination of some row housing, some small lot development, very modest amount of apartment style, and some larger single detached in areas around the periphery. I do expect that by the time we come back, we'll be looking at this in substantive detail and able to field any questions or comments. So just some of the key messages about where we are with this right now. This is really we're grappling with questions about how the land should be developed, rather than whether the land should be developed. There's kind of a fundamental difference. You know, often with these larger greenfield sites, the first question is always the should we do this? Like, is this the right approach? Is this the right idea? Does this fit with our policy framework? Does it make sense for outward expansion? Are we interested in greenfield development? There's a lot of filters that typically any outward expansion of a municipality would go through. And we've had a lot of discussions around those, but really this has been a more concentrated effort on how these lands should be developed, because the current OCP, which is under review, it puts a lot of responsibility on these lands to accommodate the housing needs of the future. Now that one might say, well, that could easily shift. The OCP may take a look at some of these things, but there's not a lot of places outside of the current growth boundary that make sense for outward expansion due to topography constraints and other things. So we know that there's going to be a lot of questions about whether these lands ought to be developed. And I think by the time we're dealing with the sub-area plan itself, we'll be in a position to address those. But really our efforts to date, the review to date, has been largely focused on the how. That's the shift from what's there now to what it would be if these approvals were made. One of the things I'll highlight and just explain quickly, we're using the OCP amendments taking the form of a sub-area plan. The village has done some neighborhood concept level plans in the past. The tool that we're looking at using as a sub-area plan is a comprehensive, it's like a mini OCP for the site. So it's written, it has a policy framework, it has bold policy statements if necessary, it has targets, it has limitations. It also gives us the ability to create development permit area guidelines that are kind of customized to the conditions on the site. So the draft that we have now, the development permit area guidelines, for example, include things like wildfire protection, steep slopes, how to manage the hillside development, how to handle the environmental significance of the site, in addition to what the character of the neighborhood should be. So the intent is that the sub-area plan will become a guidebook for what might be a 15, 20, 25-year build out over the project. It will give us a clear indication as best we can that we've thought through many of these things. And it's a tool I've employed many times for projects of this scale, and it does make sure that we kind of tie everything together and all the pieces fit before we start contemplating the rezoning. The first draft of that has been done. It's been shared internally. Call it an ugly draft because it was spelling mistakes, formatting errors, the whole bit. But we've shared it internally to see if most of the component parts are there. There's some major pieces I'll talk about in a minute that are still being worked out. So that's why we're not here today with a version of that plan. It's not ready for committee or public consumption yet at this point. And one of the main reasons, and I have a slide on this, is the engineering and utilities modeling. Again, the village had some basic models in place for water and sanitary. And what the model basically does is it looks at how the system's performing now and what the impacts of adding new burden on a system would be. And all of the models that existed are being updated and a new stormwater management model is being created so that it will take into account all of the development within the catchment of these regions, how any developable sites would plug in. And it's really important for a few reasons. One is, of course, to make sure that the systems work. And the other is to look at assigning the obligations for the improvements that are needed to the development industry in proportion. So we know that there's potential development sites that are in the same catchment as this major project. It will help allocate on an area-wide basis all of those improvements. And from a municipality's perspective, that's a critical piece to understand. And from a developer's perspective, it's a pretty critical piece to understand project viability. it's a big exercise. The developer has funded it, so it's being funded outside of normal municipal budgeting. It's being performed by the village as consultants, and suffice to say, last I heard, Scott, we're still looking at a January 2023 completion of a lot of that work, or at least the first draft of that. The other thing that's happened to date is there has been 2 initial rounds of consultation with the community hosted by the applicant. We do expect that there will be more. The report did include the consultation report that they've submitted, and in that is a lot of the verbatim comments that were received. So again, consultation is a very important part of the OCP. We expect that when the sub-area plan is ready for public viewing, when Committee of the Whole directs, we will take that out to the public, and that will also garner a lot of discussion. It will be a lot of information and ideas for the community to digest. So the consultation, my experience with the public consultation on these things is it kind of crescendos around the time that the sub-area plan goes public. That's where people can see what all of the changes are over the current land use idea. And in this case, again, it's going from a residential development area to a residential development area. But I think there's a lot of things in community values that have come up through recent studies and just general changes in the approach to land development in Pemberton that it's going to be a good check to see if we're hitting those marks if and when this goes public. Talked about the municipal service assessment. There is a portion of the village website that includes all of the technical studies submitted to date. Again, there's a lot of geotechnical information. There's a lot of modeling and other information that's been provided. And the traffic study has been vetted by the village engineer for at least for the first go around. One of the challenges with these projects is if you think of all of the moving parts, like we have this as of yet unknown servicing obligations that have to be fulfilled. We have to understand those requirements. There's archaeological issues, there's traffic issues, there's all of those things. We're almost at the stage where we've got most of that information in, and we've got a lot of it synthesized. But when it comes to things like adding in community amenities and cost allocations and those things, there is an awful lot of work that will have to happen that we haven't been able to complete yet because we don't understand the finer points of the municipal servicing obligations. Talked about the sub-area plan, the zoning approach. So again, the zoning, the big chunk of that will be the amenities negotiation. We have had some very preliminary discussions. I know for a number of reasons, the applicant has wanted to advance those. I mean, I would expect that when this comes forward, at least the zoning bylaw, there will be an amenity package. But we've held that back at a staff level because we need to understand what the servicing is first. We have to take care of that end first to see what position everyone's in to resolve the amenities. So again, the next steps on this, on the planning side, we're continuing to draft. We'll be preparing another draft over the next couple of weeks of the sub-area plan and development permit area guidelines based on the comments received so far and some of the emerging information. We will likely look at a introduction of that, I imagine probably sometime in February. I haven't really shared that with Sheena yet, so I don't know what the schedule is, but January or February would probably, it feels about right for when we'd be in a position to bring that in here and start a more formal dialogue process with the Committee of the Whole. The detailed servicing will come. We don't need every piece of the detailed servicing resolved to be in a position to come forward with a sub-area plan. It's not going to be an engineering document, but we do want to have an indication before it's finalized for certain. But we'll continue on with that work and start turning our minds to some of the more detailed issues arising out of those reports. And the additional consultation will happen as it's directed. I imagine a big component of the next report will be seeking direction from the Committee of the Whole on how and when they would like to receive additional comment on the applications that are being reviewed. So with that, we do have a staff recommendation, which is effectively a receive and file. This was intended as an update and an opportunity to ask any questions about the history or the process or where this application is headed before we come forward and engage in a more substantive review of the application materials. With that, Mr. Mayor, I'm open to any questions you may have.
Mr. Chalmers, questions? Go ahead.
Just if I understand correctly what you're saying, so like you said, the question of should we develop these areas? That question hasn't been necessarily discussed or answered yet. Or is, sorry, maybe a better way of saying is that something that will be part, you would expect that that'll be part of the discussions later on, once we have a better idea of if we are to develop it, how it's going to be developed.
Mr. Mayor, through you, the lands could be developed right now under the current zoning in OCP.
Yes.
So because it's already zoned, the implications of approving this or not approving this are not necessarily whether the lands will be developed. If these applications don't succeed, there's entitlements that would enable them to go ahead and develop now. So that's why we've been focusing more on the how questions rather than trying to justify the inclusion of these lands in the OCP document. So for example, if there was a greenfield site just on the east side of town or something like that, or the west side of town that wanted to be included in the OCP, we would be starting at a very different place than we are with this one. And so we anticipate that question is going to come up because the development hasn't happened. And council does have some ability to unwind some of the approvals that were given. But I think what we're also recognizing is that there is a bit of a benefit, if not a responsibility, to make sure that future growth is accommodated in some ways for residential growth. And of course, you could do that through density in the downtown, or you could do that in a whole host of different manners. But the way things are going now, we're not fully making the assumption that it's going to be developed this way or that way, but we're starting at a very different place than we would on a greenfield fresh approval on lands that had not been included or zoned for residential development.
Thank you.
I'll just make this one comment. I was remiss in not making it. We're not looking at significant increases in density or yield over what the original plan was. So again, the application really is refinement. It's an adjustment of certain things. I think there's some constraints that maybe would not see the realization of the first plan as it was done, but it's not starting completely fresh.
Maybe Mr. Chalmers, I could follow up on that then. So with regards to what the amendment might look like and rezoning, what is the interaction between our housing needs assessment, the building of the sub-area plan, and the conversation with the applicants in terms of what kind of housing and what diversity we do want to put up there? Like, how does that happen within the process?
Mr. Mayor, it's a fantastic question, and we haven't got to that grain of detail yet. They've submitted a concept. We're still at a staff level working in blobs and policy. We've certainly included in the first draft a lot of reference to innovative housing, to responding to housing needs, all of those sort of things, but the level to which that's more of a permissive statement or a prescriptive direction we certainly haven't got to that level of detail yet. And that's the sort of conversation we would expect to have at a committee of the whole. Again, there's always a bit of a fine balance because an OCP document, the sub-area plan even, is typically not so prescriptive that it doesn't have the ability to respond, because today's housing needs assessment might be very different than the one in 5 or 10 years when we're preparing for phase 2 or 3. So there's finding that right balance between providing clear direction about what council and the community wants to see and some flexibility to allow it to respond, sometimes to be better than what we envisioned when we wrote the plan.
I think the fact that it was zoned strictly for single family home proves that point. The change. Other questions? Go ahead.
I just want to clarify, I hear you say it's not about should it be developed or not, and I recognize that it is zoned RS1 right now. I think for me, what's missing is what's the impact of saying, yeah, go ahead with the sub-area plan without actually understanding what the applicants are asking for right now, because I think you just said it. Our responsibility is to listen to the community, and I read through the comments and the document that was prepared, and I mean, resoundingly negative. I talked to the community members, resoundingly negative. And I think, access and egress to town, so many pieces that I think we as a council have to take into consideration to help articulate what should happen up there, which I think you're saying is what we should be deciding today. But I feel like we're lacking detail on what is it that we're saying yes to here. I'm not clear.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, through you, we're not asking for any yes today. We're not even asking for detailed comments today. today was to provide some information to set the framework for that discussion. And we anticipate very clearly that there are a lot of the comments in the consultation so far, and a lot of the comments we would expect to see are not going to be based on the should versus how question. They're not. We understand that. That rarely happens even with downtown developments. And there's a number of very valid parts of that. I was referring more to the staff review, right? So we have to sharpen our pencils on that part of things. There's a lot of material that will emerge concurrently with the OCP review that will help with that. But, you know, the first time that you see this, you're going to see it at a stage that's a little more addressing the how question than the should, because with a subdivision application to the approving officer that council wouldn't even see, they could start developing additional phases. And so we can't turn our mind to the entitlements that already exist. That wouldn't be fair to the community either. It would be potentially that aren't realized or aren't realistic, because we have to think about what happens if this gets approved or what happens if this gets withdrawn or refused. And in this case, the answer is not absolutely that the lands won't be developed. Right? If these two applications get refused, the owner would have the option of filing a subdivision application, seeing the lands and a lot of the impacts that come with the development of those lands start. So we haven't found the sweet spot entirely in this messaging, I don't think, but it's something that we have to be really careful collectively in our communication about what the real outcomes of a decision either way on these files would be.
Yeah, I think you are being really clear. This is zoned. It could happen tomorrow outside of our purview, and full respect for that. I think that that's important for us to hear that. But I'm also hearing that there is a change being requested. So what I'm not clear about is what is the change that's being requested?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, through you, that is the nature of the sub area plan. So it tells a story about how the application went from what it was to what's being proposed now and why. So there's additional geotechnical information. There's a change in what is forecasted as more acceptable or attainable types of development. So it's not all larger lots, single detached. You know, there's a lot of different things that go into it, and you will certainly see the full map set and all of that as part of it. So the sub area plan should paint a fairly clear picture if we've done it right. If we're getting close, if we've done it right, it should paint a very clear picture about what this neighborhood could be. Right? The zoning will get very specific about what it actually is. The sub area plan is still not at that level. It's at a level where we have to retain some flexibility. And it gives us the ability to accommodate additional comments and questions and other important things. The zoning will follow once we get through once we're all comfortable with the sub area plan to see how prescriptive it gets. But it's not, we're just simply not there yet. You know, and it's not fair for us to come forward and get into the real details when we still have this massive albatross of the servicing obligations. We really can't speak to amenities. That's why this has taken a year and a half for us to get to this point. It's just that there's a lot of different considerations that we're trying to tie together. The application submission is in the report. It's got the drawing set, it's got some of that rationale, some of the reason for the change. And again, not as comprehensively stated as I think the sub area plan will handle it, not as balanced, but I think it's clearly to accommodate the site better.
And I think, the substance that draft of this, the SAP is presented to the committee, that's definitely an opportunity to address some of the items you were alluding to there. Does that make sense?
Mr. Mayor, through you, this will not be sort of one and done with council and committee of the whole. This is one that we expect will have several trips here for sure.
Any other questions? No. Good work. Mr. Chalmers, is there within the process of the conversation, is it even realistic, or is there conversations around another access to the community from the south?
Mr. Mayor, through you, the access, there's broader access questions that are coming out of this application. Now, the other alternative, the secondary access for the downtown, is not a natural deliverable out of this project, having been involved in other projects which seem to have a more natural role in providing a second access. We can certainly take a look at that. I don't know that it's this one carries the silver bullet we've been looking for, but we certainly can try. Yeah, it's, again, this is going to be constrained by Pemberton Creek and some pretty significant topographies. I don't know that it's the one.
But it is part of the consideration in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, right now that we have a traffic study, and you know, this is the other part of it. We get, and this is kind of typical of a lot of things that happen in Pemberton. We get a traffic study. The traffic study says all of the intersections will function just fine. That's not really the question that we're going to be facing when we go to the public.
Mhm.
Where a level of service be A, B, or C is not what's meaningful to people here. What's meaningful is, you know, can I get to where I want to go safely and quickly? Parking is not a count, it's a feeling, right? And we have to be responsive. So I think when we get the sub-area plan out there with things like how the access is actually going to work from an engineering perspective and a traffic count perspective versus some of these more value-based perspectives, that's where we'll have a lot of those conversations. But we'll certainly, if we haven't explored it in detail enough, I'll take this as an opportunity and a suggestion to go do so.
Appreciate it. Looking forward to the level.
Sorry, just so I'm clear, because you mentioned because of shifting values, this is just a refresh, right? Of what was, now it's a sub-area plan.
Mr. Mayor, I mean, it's a refresh to the extent that it's land that's
Yeah,
considered for residential and it's now being considered for a residential in a different way. So some of the densities that are contemplated or the forms are probably not, I don't believe they're all included in at least in the original zoning or the zoning that's on the site. So
yes,
none of us would be going through this exercise if there wasn't a benefit. And we believe a potential benefit to both, but yeah, it's generally a refresh. There's no large departures in land use or.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, there's no further questions. Somebody like to move a seat? Caddick, seconded by Councilor Ramsden, opposed. Mr. Chalmers. Have a good day. I'm gonna adjourn the committee of the whole. We will take a power break. No, 7-minute break. 2:30? Yeah, 2:30 for in camera. Everybody good?
Three, but.
We good?
Okay, I'm going to call to order the regular council meeting 1572 for December 13th. In honor of the Liuwatu'ul, the village of Pemberton acknowledges that we are meeting within the unceded territory of the Liuwa Nation. We are starting the meeting a little bit early, but we'll be going right into camera. And I'll look for a motion to go in camera. Moved by Councilor Craddock, second by Councilor Helmer. Any opposed? Motion carries.